Right. Okay. I don't know about you, but I have found that I am always just a tiny bit more congested in the morning, which I feel a bit conflicted about reading at this time because it's my favorite time of day, mostly because it's so quiet and peaceful and easy to just like settle in with a good book and a cup of tea. But at the same time, then my nose is all stuffy and I probably sound like I have a cold to you guys, so I don't know. I'll think about it. I'm enjoying this book though. I've noticed it takes me a chapter to like get a little bit more fluid in my reading, and then it's a bit easier. Okay. This chapter starts to gan and to go. TGAN and TGOW. September 2011. Just made a cringy face. That's a rough date. When I was a young novelist, fairly often a reviewer would get fervent and declare that an obscure book such as Call It Sleep or a hugely successful one such as The Naked and the Dead was the great American novel. By writers, the phrase was used half-jokingly, "What are you writing these days?" "Oh, you know, the great American novel." I don't think I've seen the phrase used at all for a couple of decades at least. Maybe we've given up on greatness, or anyhow on American greatness. I began quite a while ago to resist declarations of literary greatness in the sense of singling out any one book as TGAN. I get it, the great American novel, now it makes sense. Or even making lists of the great American books, partly because the supposed categories of excellence, omitting all genre writing, and the awards and rating lists and canons routinely and unquestioningly favoring work by men in the eastern half of the United States made no sense to me, but mostly because I didn't and don't think we have much idea of what's enduringly excellent until it's endured. Been around quite a long time, 5 or 6 decades to start with. Of course, the excellence of immediate, real impact of an art that embodies the moment is an excellent kind of excellence. Such a novel speaks to you now, in this moment. It tells you what's going on and when you need to know what's going on. It tells you what's going on when you need to know what's going on. It speaks to your age group or social group that nobody else can speak to, for it embodies whatever the current anguish is, or it shows a light at the end of the tunnel of the moment. I think all the enduringly excellent books began, in fact, as immediately excellent, whether they were noticed at the time or not. Their special quality is to outlast the moment and carry immediacy, impact, meaning undiminished, or even increasing with time, to ages and people entirely different from those the novelist wrote for. The great American novel, Moby Dick, not greatly noticed when published, but canonized in the 20th century, no doubt a great American novel. And the great canonical American novelists, Hawthorne, James, Twain, Faulkner, etc. But 2 books keep getting left off these lists, 2 novels that to me are genuinely, immediately, and permanently excellent. Call them great if you like the word. Certainly they are American to the bone. I won't talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, much as I love and admire it, because I want to talk about the other one. If someone came up to me in a dark alley with a sharp knife and said, "Name the great American novel or die," I would gasp forth squeakily, "The Grapes of Wrath." I wouldn't have a year ago. I first read it when I was 15 or 16. It was utterly and totally over the head of the little Berkeley High School student. Maybe under her radar is better, but we didn't know much about radar in 1945 unless you were in the Navy. I like the chapter with the tortoise early in the book. The end, the scene with Rose and Sharon and the starving man, fascinated and frightened bewildered me so much that I couldn't either forget it or think about it. Everything in the book was out of my experience. I didn't know these people. They didn't do things people I knew did. That I was going to Berkeley High School, and the children of the Joad simply didn't occur to me. No, that's not right. That I had been going to Berkeley High School with the children of the Joad simply didn't occur to me. I was socially unaware, as only a middle-class white kid in a middle-class white city can be. I was dimly aware of changes. In the 40s, the shipyards and other war employment brought a lot of people into Berkeley from the South and Southern Midwest. What I mostly noticed was that with no discussion or notice taken that I was aware of, the high school lunchroom had become segregated, self-segregated. White kids at this side, black kids that side. So okay, that's how it is now. When my brother Carl, 3 years older than me, was at BHS, the president of the student body had been a black kid, a Berkeley kid. That little artificial, peaceable kingdom was gone forever, but I could keep living on the white side of the lunchroom. I lived in it with my best friend, Jean Ainsworth. Jean's mother, Beth, was John Steinbeck's sister. A widow with 3 children, Beth worked for Shell Oil and rented out rooms in their house, higher in the Berkeley Hills than ours, way up Euclid, with a huge view of the bay, the peaceable kingdom. I got to know Uncle John a little when I was in college in the East, and Jean was working in New York City, where he then lived. He was fond of his beautiful, red-haired niece, though I don't know if he quite realized she was his equal in wit and heart. Once I sat hidden with him and Jean under a huge bush at a huge wedding in Cleveland, Ohio, and drank champagne. Jean and I forged forth for a new bottle now and then. It was Uncle John's idea. At that wedding, I had first heard, spoken in all seriousness, a now classic phrase. People were talking about Jackie Robinson, and a man said heavily threateningly, "If this goes on, they'll be moving in next door." It was after that we hid under the bush with the champagne. "We need to get away from boring people and drink in peace," Uncle John said. He did a bit too much of both those things, maybe, in his later life. He loved living high on the hog. He never went back to the austerity of his life when he was working on the Grapes of Wrath, and who can blame him, with fame and money pouring in on him? Maybe some books he might have written didn't get written, and some he wrote could have been better. I respect him for never jumping through all the hoops at Stanford, even if he kept going back and letting people like Wallace Stenger tell him that the great American novel ought to be. What the great American novel ought to be. He could write rings about any of them, but they may have helped him learn his craft, or at least showed him how to act as if he had the kind of writerly confidence that life on the farm in Salinas didn't provide, though it provided a great deal else. Anyhow, when Jean and I were still in high school, in 1945 or thereabouts, I read her famous uncle's famous novel and was awed, bored, scared, and uncomprehending. And then 60-some years later, I thought, hey, I really ought to reread some Steinbeck and see how it wears. So I went to Powell's and got The Grapes of Wrath. When I got towards the end of the book, I stopped reading it. I couldn't go on. I remembered just enough of that ending, and this time I was identified with all the people. I was lost in them. I had been living with Tom and Ma and Rose of Sharon day and night. Through the great journey and the high hopes and the brief joys and the endless suffering, I loved them, and I could not bear to think of what was coming. I didn't want to go through with it. I shut the book and ran away. Next day, I picked it up and finished it, in tears the whole time. I don't cry much anymore when I read, only poetry, that brief rush when the hair stirs, the heart swells, the eye fills. I can't remember when a novel broke my heart the way music can do, the way a tragic play does, the way this book did. I'm not saying that a book that makes you cry is a great book. It would be a wonderful criterion if only it worked. But alas, it admits effective sentimentality, the knee-jerk / heartstring stimulus. For instance, a lot of us cry when reading of the death of an animal in a story, which in itself is interesting and significant, as if we give ourselves permission to weep the lesser tears. But that is something else and less. A book that makes me cry the way music can or tragedy can, deep tears, the tears that come of accepting as my own the grief there is in the world, must have something of greatness about it. So now if somebody asks me what book would tell them the most about what is good and what is bad in America, what is the most truly American book, what is the great American novel? A year ago I would have said, for all its fault, Huckleberry Finn. But now, for all its fault, I'd say Grapes of Wrath. I saw the movie of the Grapes of Wrath, and yes, it's a good movie, faithful to the elements of the book that it could handle. And yes, Harry Fonda was fine. But a movie is something you see. A novel is something made out of language. And what's beautiful and powerful in this novel is its language. The art that not only shows us what the author saw, but lets us share as directly as emotion can be shared his passionate grief, indignation, and love. This chapter is called TGAN Again, November 2013. A question from New Bookends. Where is the great American novel by a woman? Got an interesting answer from the Pakistani novelist Mohsin Hamid. Bear with me as I advocate the death of the great American novel. Pause. The problem is in the phrase itself. Great and novel are fine enough, but the is needlessly exclusionary, and American is unfortunately parochial. The whole capitalized seems to speak to a deep and abiding insecurity, perhaps a colonial legacy. How odd it would be to call Homer's Iliad or Rumi's Masnavi the great Eastern Mediterranean poem. I like this very much, but there's something coy and coercive about the question itself that made me want to charge into the bull ring, head down and horns forward. There's an asterisk here. It says, in the 1920s, on a great Peruvian hacienda with a private bull ring, my parents watched matadors in training fight cows. The full ritual was performed, except that injury to the animal was avoided, and it did not end in a kill. It was the best training, my parents were told. After Las Vacas Bravas, bulls were easy. An angry bull goes for the red flag. An angry cow goes for the matador. I'd answer it with a question. Where is the great American novel by anybody? And I'd answer that, who cares? I think this is pretty much what Mr. Hamid says more politely when he says that art is bigger than notions of black or white, male or female, American or non. Human beings don't necessarily exist inside of or correspond to the neat racial, gendered, or national boxes in which we often unthinkingly place them. It's a mistake to ask literature to reinforce those structures. Literature tends to crack them. Literature is where we free ourselves. 3 cheers and amen to that. But I want to add this note. To me, the keystone of the phrase, the great American novel, is not the word American, but the word great. Greatness in the sense of outstanding or unique accomplishment is a crypto-gendered word. In ordinary usage and common understanding, a great American means a great American man. A great writer means a great male writer. To regender the word, it must modify a feminine noun. A great American woman, a great woman writer. To degender it, it must be used in a locution such as great Americans / writers, both men and women. Greatness in the abstract in general is still thought of as the province of men. The writer who sets out to write the great American novel must see himself as a free citizen of that province, competing on equal ground with other writers, living and dead. For a glittering prize, a unique honor, his career is a contest, a battle, with victory over other men as its goal. He is unlikely to think much about women as competitors. Only in this view of the writer as a fully privileged male, a warrior, literature as a tournament, greatness as the defeat of others, can the idea of the great American novel exist. That's a good deal to swallow these days for most writers over 14. I'll bet the whole nation of the great American novel is nothing like as common and meaningful an idea among authors as it is among readers, fans, PR people, reviewers, those who don't read but know authors by name as celebrities, and people who need something to blog about. Now, this may get me told off by women who value competitiveness and feel the problem with women is that they think they shouldn't or can't compete, but I'll say it all the same. It makes perfect sense to me that I've never heard a woman writer say she intended or wanted to write the great American novel. Tell you true, I've never heard a woman writer say the phrase the great American novel without a sort of snort. Whatever the virtues of competitiveness, women are still deeply trained by society to be cautious about laying claim to greatness greater than the greatness of men. As you know, Jim, a woman who competes successfully with men in a field men consider theirs by right risks being punished for it. Literature is a field a great many men consider theirs by right. Virginia Woolf committed successful competition in that field. She barely escaped the first and most effective punishment, omission from the literary canon after her death. Yet 80 or 90 years later, charges of snobbery and invalidism are still used to discredit and diminish her. Marcel Proust's limitations and his neuroticism were at least as notable as hers, but that Proust needed not only a room of his own, but a cork-lined one is taken as proof he was a genius. That Woolf heard the birds singing in Greek shows only that she was a sick woman. That's not fair. As long as men need to be reflected as twice their natural size, a woman writer knows that open competition with them is dangerous. Even if she wants to write the or a great American novel, she's unlikely to announce, as male writers do from time to time, that she plans to or has written it. And if she feels she deserves a Pulitzer or Booker or Nobel or anyhow wouldn't mind having one, she knows most literary awards are weighted so heavily in favor of men that the social efforts involved in most major awards, the networking and careful self-presentation, are a great expense for an unlikely return. But risk avoidance isn't all there is to it, because competition for primacy, for literary supremacy, doesn't seem as glamorously possible for women as it does for men. The whole idea of singular greatness, of there being one great anything, may not have the hold on a woman's imagination that than it has on a man's. The knights in the list have to believe the prize can be won and is worth winning. Those relegated to the preliminary jousts in the sidelines can see more clearly how arbitrary the judgment of championship is, and can question the value of the glittering prize. Who wants the great American novel anyhow? PR people. People who believe that bestsellers are better than other books because they sell better than other books, and that the prize-winning book is the best book because it won the prize. Tired teachers, timid teachers, lazy students who'd like one text to read instead of many great and greatly complex books that make up literature. I'm going to reread that sentence. Just going to read the end. Tired teachers, timid teachers, lazy students who'd like one text to read instead of the many great and greatly complex books that make up literature. There we go. Art is not a horse race. Literature is not the Olympics. The hell with the great American novel. We have all the great American novels we need right now. And right now, some man or woman is writing a new one we won't know we needed till we read it. So true. The narrative gift as a moral conundrum. May 2012. The narrative gift is that what to call it? The storyteller's knack is developed in writing. Storytelling is clearly a gift, a talent, a specific ability. Some people just don't have it. They rush or drone, jumble the order of events, skip essentials, dwell on inessentials, and then muff the climax. Don't we all have a relative who we pray won't launch into a joke or a bit of family history because the history will bore us and the joke will bomb? But we may also have a relative who can take the stupidest, nothingest little event and make it into what copywriters call a gut-wrenchingly brilliant thriller and a laugh riot. Or, as Cousin Vern says, that Cousin Myra, she sure knows how to tell a story. When Cousin Myra goes literary, you have a force to contend with. But how important is that knack to writing fiction? How much of it, or what kind of it, is essential to excellence? And what is the connection to the narrative gift with literary quality? I'm talking about story, not about plot. E.M. Forster had a low opinion of story. He said story is, the queen died and then the king died, while plot is, the queen died and then the king died of grief. To him, story is just, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. A succession without connection. A plot introduces connection or casualty, therefore shape and form. Plot makes sense of story. I honor E.M. Forster, but I don't believe this. Children often tell, this happened and then this happened. And so do people naively recounting their dream or a movie, but in literature, story in Forster's sense doesn't exist. Not even the silliest action potboiler is a mere succession of unconnected events. I have a high opinion of story. I see it as the essential trajectory of narrative, a coherent onward movement taking the reader from here to there. Plot, to me, is variation or complication of the movement of story. Story goes, plot elaborates the going. Plot hesitates, pauses, doubles back, Proust, forecast, leaps, doubling or tripling simultaneous trajectories, Dickens, diagrams a geometry onto the storyline, Hardy, makes the story makes the story Ariadne's string leading through a labyrinth, mysteries, turns the story into a cobweb, a waltz, a vast symphonic structure in time, the novel in general. They are supposed to be only so many plots, 3, 5, 10 in all fiction. I don't believe that either. Plot is manifold, inexhaustibly ingenious, endless in connections and casualties and complications. But through all the twists and turns and red herrings and illusions of plot, the trajectory of story is there, going forward. If it isn't going forward, the fiction flounders. I suppose plot without story is possible. Perhaps one of those incredibly complex cerebral spy thrillers where you need a GPS to get through the book at all. And story without plot occurs occasionally in literary fiction. Woolf's The Mark on the Wall, perhaps. Oftener in literary nonfiction. A biography, for instance, can't really have a plot unless the subject obligingly provided one by living it. But the great biographers make you feel that the story of the life you've told has an aesthetic completeness equal to that of plotted fiction. Lesser biographers and memorialists often invent a plot to foist onto their factual story. They don't trust it to work by itself, so they make it untrustworthy. I believe a good story, plotted or plotless, rightly told, is satisfying as such and in itself. But here, with rightly told, is my conundrum or mystery. Inept writing lames or cripples good narratives only if it's truly inept. An interesting, irresistibly readable story can be told in the most conventional, banal prose if the writer has the gift. I read a book last winter that does an absolutely smashing job of storytelling, a compulsive page-turner from page 1 on. The writing is competent at best, rising above banality only in some dialogue. The author's ear for the local working-class dialect is pitch perfect. Several characters are vividly or sympathetically portrayed, but they're all stereotypes. The plot has big holes in it, though only one of them really damages credibility. The storyline, an ambitious white girl in her early 20s persuades a group of black maids in Jackson, Mississippi in 1964 to tell her their experiences with their white employers, past and present, so that she can make a book of their stories and share them with the world by selling it to Harper and Row and go to New York and be rich and famous. They do, and she does. And except for a couple of uppity, mean white women getting some egg on their face, nobody suffers for it. All Archimedes wanted was a solid place to put the lover he was going to move the world with. Same with a story trajectory. You can't throw a shot put far if you're standing on shaky 2-inch wide plank over a deep dark river. You need solid footing. Or do you? All this author had to stand on is a hokey sentimental notion, and from it she threw this perfect pitch. Seldom, if ever, have I seen the power of pure story over mind, emotion, and artistic integrity so clearly shown. And I had to think about it because a few months earlier I'd read a book that brilliantly demonstrates a narrative gift in the service of clear thought, honest feeling, and passionate integrity. It tells an extremely complicated story extending over many decades and involving many people, from geneticists, cloning cells in cloistered laboratories, to families in the shack houses of black farming communities. The story explains scientific concepts and arguments with great clarity, while never for a moment losing its onward impetus. It handles the human beings it involves with human compassion and a steady, luminous, ethical focus. The prose is of unobtrusive excellence, and if you can stop reading it, you're a better man than I am. Gunga Din. I couldn't stop even when I got to the notes, even when I got to the index. More, go on, please tell me more. I see a huge difference in literary quality between these two hugely readable books, which certainly has to do with specific qualities of character, among them patience, honesty, and risk-taking. Catherine Stockett, the white woman who wrote The Help, tells of a white girl persuading black women to tell her intimate details of the injustices and hardships of their lives as servants, a highly implausible undertaking in Mississippi in '64. When the white employers begin to suspect this tattling, only an equally implausible plot trick lets the black maids keep their jobs. Their sole motivation is knowing their stories will be printed. The mortal risk they would have run in bearing such witness at that place in that year is not seriously imagined, but merely exploited to great suspense. White girl's motivation is a kind of high-minded ambition. Her risks all become rewards. She loses malevolent friends and a bigoted boyfriend, and leaves Mississippi behind for a brilliant big city career. The author's sympathy for the black women and knowledge of their everyday experience is evident, but for me it was made questionable by her assumption of a right to speak for people without earning that right, and killed dead by the wish-fulfilling improbability of her story. Rebecca Skloot, the white woman who wrote The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, spent years researching a vastly complex web of scientific research, thefts, discoveries, mistakes, deceits, cover-ups, exploitations, and reparations, while at the same time trying with incredible patience and goodwill to gain the trust of the people most directly affected by the one human life with which all that research and profit-making began, the family of Henrietta Lacks. These were people who had good reason to feel that they would be endangered or betrayed if they trusted any white person. It took her literally years to win their confidence. Evidently, she showed them that she deserved it by her patient willingness to listen and learn, her rigorous honesty, and her compassionate awareness of who and what was and is truly at risk. Of course her story is superior, said Mr. Gradgrind. It's non-fiction. It's true. Fiction is mere hokum. But oh, Mr. Gradgrind, so much non-fiction is awful hokum. How bad and mean my mommy was to me before I found happiness in buying a wonderful old castle in Nodond and fixing it up as an exclusive gourmet B&B while bringing modern educational opportunities to the village children. And contrarily, we can learn so much truth by reading novels such as the novel in which you appear, Mr. Gradgrind. No, that's not where the problem lies. The problem, my problem, is with the gift of story. If one of the two books I've been talking about is slightly soiled fluff, while the other is solid gold, how come I couldn't stop reading either of them? Okay. I'm going to read one more, and I'm going to stop for now because my memory is getting full again. It's almost 7. It doesn't have to be the way it is. June 2011. The test of fairyland is that you cannot imagine 2 and 1 not making 3, but you can easily imagine trees not growing fruit. You can imagine them growing golden candlesticks or tigers hanging on by the tail. The quotation from G.K. Chesterton is from an interesting article by Bernard Manzo in the Times Literary Supplement of June 10, 2011. He didn't give the source in Chesterton's writings. It got me thinking about how imaginative literature from folktale to fantasy operates, and to wondering about its relationship to science, though I'll only get to that at the very end of this piece. The fantastic tale may suspend the laws of physics. Carpets fly, cats fade into invisibility, leaving only a smile, and of probability. The youngest of 3 brothers always wins the bride. The infant in the box cast upon the water survives unharmed. But it carries its revolt against reality no further. Mathematical order is unquestioned. 2 and 1 make 3. In Cochesse's Castle and Alice's Wonderland, especially in Wonderland, Euclid's geometry, or possibly Riemann's, somebody's geometry anyhow, governs the layout. Otherwise, incoherence would invade and paralyze the narrative. There lies the main difference between childish imaginings and imaginative literature. The child telling the story roams about among the imaginary and the half-understood without knowing the difference. content with the sound of language and the pure play of fantasy with no particular end, and that's the charm of it. But fantasies, whether folktales or sophisticated literature, are stories in the adult demanding sense. They can ignore certain laws of physics, but not of casualty. They start here and go there, or back here. And though the mode of travel may be unusual, and here and there may be wildly exotic and unfamiliar places, yet they must both have a location on the map of that world and a relationship to the map of our world. If not, the hearer and reader of the tale will be set adrift in a sea of inconsequential inconsistencies, or worse yet, left drowning in the shallow puddle of